The following program is being brought to you on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. For more information about our network and to check our additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit voiceamericahealth.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit voiceamerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the following program are strictly those of the host or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by the Voice America Talk Radio Network, its staff, and management.
Loss in our lives takes on many different forms and can be more than just a physical loss. It goes beyond that to include emotional loss, business loss, and loss of personal health. This is Voices for Healing with Cathy Roberts. Today, Cathy and her guests will help you find out that you are not alone in dealing with loss and grief. There are so many different ways to deal with loss. What works for some may not work for others. Together, let's find the solution that you can use. Here's your host, Cathy Roberts.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to Voices for Healing Talk Radio. I'm your host, Cathy Roberts. In my work as a professional counselor, coach, and educator based in the Maryland suburbs of Washington, D.C., I work with people living with and growing in response to all sorts of loss and change. You can learn more about me and my work on my website, cathyroberts.net. When you sign up for my newsletter, you will now receive a free MP3 vitality-boosting meditation. So I invite you to explore my website and sign up for the newsletter. You can also subscribe to Voices for Healing on iTunes and get regular podcast downloads of this radio program. I want to acknowledge Pathways Magazine for their support of this radio show. Pathways is a free quarterly journal distributed throughout the Washington, D.C. area. Pick up a copy at your favorite library or health food store. The summer issue is now available, and the fall issue will come out on September 1st or thereabouts. And for listeners across the nation and around the world who are curious about what Pathways is all about, you can read parts of the magazine at www.pathwaysmagazine.com. Each week, this show features a guest who has expertise in some area of healing loss and finding opportunity in chaos. My wish is for everyone listening that you connect with some of what you hear on these shows and be inspired to use challenges to grow and become your most real, authentic self through all of the things that come to you in your daily life. Today, my guest is Mark Epstein, author of The Trauma of Everyday Life. Hello, Mark, and welcome to Voices for Healing. Hi.
Hi.
I want to let our listeners know that the paperback edition of Mark's book, The Trauma of Everyday Life, is now available. And so you can check that out and you can find it. Mark will tell us a little later in the show how you can go about getting that. And I want to let our listeners know about who Mark is as we get started. Mark Epstein is a psychiatrist in private practice in New York City, and the author of a number of books about the interface of Buddhism and psychotherapy, including Thoughts Without a Thinker and Psychotherapy Without the Self. He received his undergraduate and medical degrees from Harvard University and is currently a clinical assistant professor in the postdoctoral program in psychotherapy and psychoanalysis at New York University. I'm glad you're here with us today, Mark. Your book is just a phenomenal interface, as I mentioned, of psychotherapy and Buddhism, and there's just a wealth of good stuff in there for people to know about.
Oh, thank you.
We hear so much about trauma, and often we equate it with major events and tragedies. You take us in a more, what I think, is a more comprehensive direction as we begin to look at the impact of lesser traumas that happen in our daily lives. Some of these are even developmental traumas. Share with us your interest in trauma and how you came to write this particular book.
Well, I'd be happy to try to do that. My route to writing this book was actually kind of circuitous. I didn't know I was interested in trauma when I started writing this book, in fact. I discovered that I was interested in trauma as I was writing the book. I was preoccupied for some really unknown reason when I began the book with a little-known fact in the history of the life of the Buddha, which was that his mother died 5 days after giving birth to him. And as a psychiatrist who's been interested in Buddhism and influenced by Buddhism since before I knew very much about anything, I was intrigued that no one had ever done anything with this bit of information. It was, it existed in the reports of the Buddha's life, but no one made anything out of it, and I couldn't believe that. So I decided, well, if no one else has made anything of this, I'm going to try to make something of this. What could it have meant for the Buddha that his mother died when he was 5 days old? So I began wanting to write a kind of psychobiography, the way Erik Erikson did of Luther or Gandhi. I wanted to write a kind of psychobiography of the Buddha. And that material is in the book, but gradually it morphed into a bigger discussion about trauma, big T trauma, the huge things that only happen to a few unlucky people, little T trauma, like the developmental or relational trauma that happens to some unfortunate children when they're not attended to properly, and then all the tiny traumas of everyday life, where that we're fending off as best we can as we move from birth to death.
I was fascinated by what you wrote about Buddha's mother dying 5 days after his birth, because I didn't know that, or if I did know that, it hadn't computed with me.
Yeah.
And I'm an adoptive mother, and I have spent a lot of time and learned a lot from my daughter, who came into my life when she was 3 years old, and have some advanced training in working with adoption. And one of the things that became very clear to me in my work in adoption is that all adopted children experience trauma simply by that first loss, which is the loss of all that was familiar about that mother's body.
Yeah.
And I guess you could even say we all do in some way as we come out of the womb and into the world. But for most of us, we still have that same mother, that same heartbeat, that same voice.
Yeah.
And yet children who've been adopted don't have that, and that they have that, just initial trauma of loss. And I couldn't help but think about what I know about that and what you were writing about.
Yeah, well, that's really interesting that you've had that experience firsthand through your daughter. The thing about kids who are adopted and the traumas that we infer they must have experienced by that disruption, the loss of the mother that they knew in their bodies, they couldn't have known yet in their minds, because their minds are not developed yet enough to know who's who. But that was precisely what I was trying to talk about with the Buddha. 5 days in, his mother dies. So then he's raised by his mother's sister, his aunt, who marries his father. So in the Buddhist culture, they say, so what? There was a loving maternal presence there. There were wet nurses to feed him. Why should this be such a big deal? And we, in our culture, say much the same thing about adopted kids, They don't really have a memory of the biological mother. That happens so much at the beginning of their lives. Why should that affect them? But we know from psychoanalysis that people carry emotional memories in their bodies that are not necessarily accessible to the cognitive thinking mind, but that can nevertheless color the whole personality. And those kinds of experiences were part of what I was trying to talk about in this book.
Yeah, I think you did a really nice job of that. And I also think that both these things can be true, in that we can have unrecognized, unremembered trauma that is held in the body and in the energetic system of the body, and have good and adequate parenting, mothering, caregiving, whatever the result of is that separation, like the Buddha had with his aunt, or many adopted children have with the loving parents who are just so wanting this child and so happy to give the child so much love. And yet, if we only acknowledge that the positive role of the caregiving, and we don't also acknowledge that original loss, I think we're missing something.
No, I think so too. I think that's a big part of what I'm trying to find words for in the book, and I think one of the things that can be healing for people in the kind of situation that we're describing is to find words to describe this feeling that can be like a gap or a void or an unknown kind of pool of longing, that once it's possible to put some kind of narrative, to find some kinds of words to describe what that feeling is like, there's a sense of being able to integrate it into the person, of being able to use it for one's own growth and development, and also empathically to use it to relate to other people. I don't think it's only adopted kids who have to deal with this. One whole part of my work is about the kinds of primitive agonies, we call it, primitive agonies of young children where the fit with the parents is not good enough, where they're left with emotional experiences that no one is helping them with, and where they don't really have the verbal or cognitive capacities themselves to understand what they're experiencing, like parents not coming when they're needed kind of thing. And that also gets held in the body and has to be made sense of as the person moves into adulthood, or else it tends to color all of one's intimate relationships.
One of the other things I liked about your writing, and this is something I've experienced myself too, is that sense that we who, like you say, we may not have had young parental loss at an early age or be adopted, but yet at some point in life, and for me it was in my mid to late 20s, I began to just feel like something was missing. I almost had a sense of something feels wrong with me. It's like there's something that just doesn't feel quite right. I have, on the external, I have everything I want and everything I think I would have to be happy. And yet I feel like something's missing. Mm-hmm. And you described something like that in your own, that began your own quest and your search in the Buddhist kind of practices that helped you out with that. And I just also, and you probably encounter this too, I encounter sometimes people in my work who will say something like that to me. And I think it is something that a lot of us carry just because of, I'll just call it maybe like what you call it, everyday trauma that we had as children, where we didn't get what we wanted every moment, and then we felt something about it, and that got lodged in the body, and in some way might still be there, keeping us from our own fullness. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, 2,500 years ago, the Buddha developed a very comprehensive philosophy and psychology, and I always think of Buddhism as the most spiritual of the world's psychologies and the most psychological of the world's religions. But he came up with a word, which was dukkha, which is conventionally translated as suffering, to describe that thing that I think you're talking about, the feeling of something being not quite right, even though it, by all counts, it should be, so what's wrong? Why are you complaining? And the word dukkha actually means hard to face. So what the Buddha was saying is that there are aspects to life that even for those of us who are in the luckiest of circumstances, the most fortunate of circumstances, there are aspects to life that are hard to face. And that it's that concept that I think brought me around to writing about trauma, because the thing that we've learned as Western psychiatrists dealing with trauma, war trauma or rape trauma or, earthquake trauma, or developmental trauma, all kinds of traumas, is that Trauma happens when there's actual or threatened death or serious injury or a threat to the physical integrity of self or others, and the response to that must involve intense fear, helplessness, or horror. So we think of that as happening, only to a few unfortunate people who get caught in, events beyond their control, but all of us, to one degree or another, are having to deal with death or serious injury to ourselves or our loved ones. The specter of that is hanging over us. We may avoid it for 20 or 30 years, but we feel it coming, and that sense of fear, helplessness, or horror is something that is lurking. And what we know from helping people who have been traumatized is that the major defense against those feelings is what we call dissociation, so that the difficult emotions themselves are kind of shunted aside, put behind a closed door or locked in the basement and not attended to, so that the ego doesn't disintegrate, so that the person can go on and live a decent life. But those more difficult feelings are like knocking on the basement door, giving us bad dreams and so on. So the Buddha's way was to open the door to the basement, let those feelings come trickling in, and to use them to teach yourself how to be with the things that are hard to face. And we would say that's like a way of countering the defense of dissociation.
Very true. There's a story that I want to share when we come back. We're getting ready to take our first break here, and I'd like to share a quote from Sting before we take our break. And Sting says, "I don't need to manufacture trauma in my life to be created. I have a big enough reservoir of sadness or emotional trauma to last me." And I just share that quote with everybody because when we look inside, I think we will all find something like that, just like what Mark was talking about. You might not be aware of it, but it's down there in the basement, and every now and then it knocks on the door. We're going into our break, and we will be right back.
Find out what's happening on the Voice America Talk Radio Network by keeping up with us on Twitter. You can find us at Voice America TRN.
Cathy Roberts offers Circle of Voices teleclasses to help you focus your mind, engage your energy, and awaken your inner guide. Through this experiential and interactive series, you will know yourself more and learn to express yourself authentically in your personal life. Visit Cathy's website at cathyroberts.net to find out about this teleclass series designed to open you to change and engage healing in the fabric of your life. Go to cathyroberts.net or call Cathy at 301-651-0019 for more information. Cathy Roberts is not only an exceptional radio host, she's an exceptional listener and counselor. Cathy appeals to motivated, high-functioning people to help them improve their health and vitality. Cathy can meet you where you are and help you identify what you want. Visit Cathy's website at www.cathyroberts.net or call her at 301-651-0019. Cathy works with both individuals and couples and specializes in grief and depression counseling. Get to know yourself by working with Cathy. Visit cathyroberts.net or call 301-651-0019.
Become our friend on Facebook. Post your thoughts about our shows and network on our timeline. Visit facebook.com/Voice America.
You are listening to Voices for Healing with your host, Cathy Roberts. If you have a question or comment for the program, please send an email to Cathy at cathyroberts.net. That's Cathy at cathyroberts.net. Now back to Voices for Healing.
Welcome back to Voices for Healing. I'm Cathy Roberts, and today with me is my guest, Mark Epstein. Mark is the author of The Trauma of Everyday Life. He's a psychiatrist in New York City, and we are talking about trauma, Buddhism, and their effect, the kind of effects that trauma has on us and how Buddhism can be supportive of that and give us more awareness. I want to follow up on what Mark was talking about before we took our break. He was talking about trauma arises in us when there's a situation that causes fear, helplessness, or horror to us. And we respond to that by pushing it away and dissociating from it is the word we use. And while he was talking, I was reminded of a story that a child psychologist told me many years ago when my own children were little and I was learning how to be the best parent I could be to them. And this psychologist told me a story about being at the zoo in Washington and witnessing a child in a stroller who saw off in the distance a lion. And the lion was quite a ways away, but the child saw the lion and was fearful of the lion. And the child just began shrieking and screaming and crying. And the parents or other people who were standing around were saying things like, "Oh, that lion can't get you. Look, there's a big trough between you and the lion. The lion can't jump over the fence," and all that. And none of those thoughts were, none of those things that the adults were saying were helping the child. The child was just screaming more and more. And finally, the person who witnessed this saw somebody get right down beside the child and say to that child very quietly, "That lion is really scary, isn't it?" And those words, that acknowledgement of the child's experience, got the child to just, then stop crying, but, sniffle and settle down. Mm-hmm. And I just think that's a beautiful story of what happens when we experience at any age that fear, helplessness, and horror, and what we need. Yeah, when that happens. I want your thoughts on that.
I think it's a beautiful story also because it illustrates so well the emotional lives of young children and how much they need us to acknowledge and relate to and understand what it is that they're experiencing. Young children have the whole range of emotions that we have, including intense desire, intense rage, intense fear, anxiety, feelings of helplessness, and so on. And as parents or as caregivers, most of us are well-intentioned trying to do the right thing, but we often respond just as the adults in your story respond, by kind of brushing it off to one side, like it'll be all right, it's not that scary, come on. When the kid's experience is of, intense fear, etc. So your person getting down on their knees and whispering, very therapeutically, like Carl Rogers, just affirming what the child's experience is. Children need that so much. We're so scared for them. We want their difficult feelings to go away. But the thing that really helps them is for us to hold those feelings with our minds, not necessarily hold the children in our arms, but hold their difficult feelings in our minds to help them digest those feelings, understand those feelings, metabolize those feelings, so that they come to appreciate that difficult, scary feelings are bearable. That's one of the major tasks of raising young children. And we as therapists, we work to sort of clean up what needs cleaning up, when it didn't go well.
Yeah, and I think of how often our work as therapists is also helping people tolerate those scary feelings to a greater degree. And that's a big piece of what it is. A lot of it's there.
What it is, yes.
And how do we tolerate it more so that we can have more of ourselves available to us and not have to shut it off?
Yeah, and not be afraid of future situations that are going to bring up, feelings of abandonment or difficult kind of fused rage with desire, and make people act out in destructive ways. The thing about dissociation is that it's very effective. It banishes the difficult feelings so that you hardly know they're there, but then a situation comes, and we know this from post-traumatic stress and so on, a situation comes that triggers those feelings, and there's no space in the mind for thought. The feelings just erupt, and the person, we call it in therapy acting out, the person just acts impulsively, often destructively, because they haven't built up that ability to tolerate, as you're saying, the breadth of their difficult feelings.
Yeah, I think one thing that most of us can use some work on is our own shadows and work on ourselves. When you were talking about how important it is for adults to be able to get down to that child's level and acknowledge what's going on with the child, I think about how we have to have a degree of knowing what's going on inside of us and being okay with it to do that, because anxiety and fear and anger can even be really contagious. And children who have those things can pass it on really quickly to the adults around them when adults aren't self-aware and acknowledging that, wait, you know, this fear that I'm feeling all of a sudden is really this child's fear. And how can I help the child if I'm suddenly flooded, like you were just describing, with that fear myself?
Yeah, well, that's why it was interesting to write about the Buddha, because I could start to see, once I looked at what we know about his life through the lens of this early loss of the mother, that he actually, in his journey towards awakening, he actually had to come to terms with a whole range of his most difficult feelings that he really had no tolerance for. He went through years and years of self-torture, you know, acting out, a lot of angry, self-deprecating, unworthy feelings, some of which might have stemmed from that early gap that we talked about from the loss of the biological mother. And it really wasn't until he had a childhood memory at the height of his self-punishing practices. The only time a childhood memory comes into the Buddha's story, he remembered himself as about 8 or 9 years old, sitting under a tree while his father was a little distance away plowing in the fields, and he was spontaneously happy sitting under the tree, watching his father. And at the height of his, most intense self-hatred, this memory came wafting through his mind, and he had the presence of mind to wonder, why am I remembering this now? And then he realized maybe that feeling of, like everything's actually okay in me, maybe that feeling has something to do with the path to the enlightenment that I'm seeking. And he turned himself all around at that point and stopped. He was basically like an anorectic patient of our own time, and he stopped punishing himself and started eating again, and then took a long walk and ended up at the Bodhi tree and sat down and found his enlightenment.
I want to slow down a minute here around that story.
Okay.
I really do. So he was in something of his ascetic or kind
we
of
call it ascetic for him, but in our day we would call it anorectic.
Anorectic, okay.
Uh-huh.
And you used the word. Oh, go ahead.
He was he was in the psychiatric hospital, of his own making.
Yeah. And you used the word that this was the moment of his deepest self-hatred.
Yeah.
And then while he was sitting in that moment, he had this spontaneous memory of being happy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm still trying to just kind of grasp. Grasp, isn't that a great Buddhist word?
Grasp, yeah. We like that word.
What that means and what that's saying.
Well, he was totally identified with trying to get rid of his nasty body, his nasty desires, his nasty emotions. He was trying to beat himself into subjugation, as what they were spiritual practices like that in those days. There are in our day too. Kind of rending of the flesh, and it wasn't working. He'd been doing it for years, and it wasn't working. He could still feel that that sense of there being something hard to face, there being something difficult, something uncomfortable, some kind of anguish within was still there. And then, really spontaneously, out of the blue, he had this memory of himself. And he felt afraid when he had the memory, which is a key part of it that I didn't tell you before. But he felt afraid. And then, but he was doing a kind of self-analysis, sort of the way Freud did a self-analysis by taking cocaine regularly. The Buddha was doing his own self-analysis. And he saw the fear. He saw that he was afraid of the feeling that was evoked by the memory of, being content. And he thought, why am I afraid of this? That's so weird. And then he said, maybe I shouldn't be afraid. Maybe I don't have to be afraid of this. And the idea there is that the inner peace or the enlightenment, the awakened state, it's already there inside of him. Up until that point, he was operating under the premise that he was bad. There's something wrong with him. If he could just eliminate himself, then he could go to the divine.
Yes.
But the revelation was, it's not outside of me, it's inside of me. And I'm not defined by my trauma, Despite the fact that I'm filled with all of these negative feelings, there's something else in me which is pure, which is good. And I can connect to that by stopping this whole thing of beating up on myself.
That description that you gave as you talked about that loosening of identification that he had with his misery, and then the fear he had of this other part of him that he was not at all connected to, but he was in that moment getting connected to. Was really just beautiful. That was just a beautiful description of that. And it's, I resonate with that our awakened state, our Buddhists wouldn't call it that, but our divinity or our greater connection is already inside. It's not something that we have to seek outside to get, although we tend to do that again and again and again. It's more something like what the Buddha did, which is to remove the barriers in us that are keeping us from it already.
That's the theory. I can't say from experience because I'm not awakened, I'm not enlightened, but I recognize the fear that he described upon settling into his contented self. It's strange that we should be afraid of our best qualities, but I myself know that to be true.
Yeah, it reminds me of the quote that is either attributed to Marianne Williamson or Nelson Mandela. I don't know who, but the one about the greatest fear we have is not what is it? Is not how small we are, but how great we are. Something like that. I'm saying it really badly.
Yeah, but that's the same point.
Yeah. I'm really glad we're getting into this description of this here because it's helping me to understand that and understand the Buddha and his enlightenment as a process that he experienced.
He was really seeing something special, that in this world which is filled with birth and death, in which everything is changing and you really can't hold on to anything, which is so scary and makes us feel like we're doing something wrong and that we have to build walls to protect ourselves at the expense of everybody else, that there is another way of experiencing this world of constant change, which had to do with how he felt in that moment under the tree. That it's possible really to embrace it all, including our fears about it.
Yes, that's just beautifully said. I'm a little slowed down as I take all this in. So
I had a conversation once when I was first traveling in Asia with some of my American Buddhist teachers, and we went to Thailand to visit the teacher of one of my teachers, the Thai teacher of one of my teachers, and a man named Ajahn Chah, a great teacher in the forest monasteries of Thailand, and we asked him about this, and he gave a great little teaching that I always remember, where he picked up the water glass that he drank from next to him, and he held up the glass, and he said, do you see this glass? I love this glass. It holds the water admirably. When the sun shines on it, it reflects the light, makes beautiful patterns. But he said, for me, the glass is already broken. When it sits on the shelf and I knock it off with my elbow, or when the wind blows and it falls, I say, of course. But he said, because for me the glass is already broken, every minute with it is precious. Mm-hmm. And it was that last part, about every minute with it is precious, that I thought was really the Buddhist contribution, because it's easy to say, okay, everything's broken, everything dies, so then, what's the point, and to go into a kind of place of despair. But his take was, knowing that means that you can live your whole life with the understanding that everything is precious, even in the midst of birth and death, even in the midst of trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's something I've been working with for a couple of years now, is seeking out joy and that preciousness even in the midst of trauma. Mark, it's already time for us to go out on another break. Let me share a quote from Sharon Salzberg with our listeners as we end this segment of the show. Sharon writes, "Someone who has experienced trauma also has gifts to offer all of us in their depth, their knowledge of our universal vulnerability, and their experience of the power of compassion." We'll continue our conversation with Mark Epstein after our break.
Find out what's happening on the Voice America Talk Radio Network by keeping up with us on Twitter. You can find us at Voice America TRN.
Cathy Roberts offers Circle of Voices teleclasses to help you focus your mind, engage your energy, and awaken your inner guide. Through this experiential and interactive series, you will know yourself more and learn to express yourself authentically in your personal life. Visit Cathy's website at cathyroberts.net to find out about this teleclass series, designed to open you to change and engage healing in the fabric of your life. Go to cathyroberts.net or call Cathy at 301-651-0019 for more information. Cathy Roberts is not only an exceptional radio host, she's an exceptional listener and counselor. Cathy appeals to motivated, high-functioning people to help them improve their health and vitality. Cathy can meet you where you are and help you identify what you want. Visit Cathy's website at www.cathyroberts.net or call her at 301-651-0019. Cathy works with both individuals and couples and specializes in grief and depression counseling. Get to know yourself by working with Cathy. Visit cathyroberts.net or call 301-651-0019.
Become our friend on Facebook. Post your thoughts about our shows and network on our timeline. Visit facebook.com/Voice America.
You are listening to Voices for Healing with your host, Cathy Roberts. If you have a question or comment for the program, please send an email to Cathy at cathyroberts.net. That's Cathy at cathyroberts.net. Now back to Voices for Healing.
As we begin our concluding segment of Voices for Healing, I want to thank my colleagues at Core Constellation Center in Rockville, Maryland, for their support of this program. Mark, your book is just out in paperback. I would love for you to share with our listeners any upcoming events you have and how people can reach you.
Well, I'll be in St. Louis on Monday, August the 4th, in Boulder, at the Boulder Bookstore on Tuesday, August the 5th, and in Seattle at the University Bookstore on Wednesday, August the 6th. And then I'll be leading a workshop with Professor Robert Thurman of Columbia University at a retreat center called Menla in Phoenicia, New York, the weekend of August the 15th. Those are the only things I have scheduled until a workshop in Portland, Oregon, which is the weekend of December 13th.
Very good.
There's a website. I have a website, Mark Epstein MD, and a Facebook page that's also Mark Epstein MD that lists all these kinds of things.
Good. So you can go to markepsteinmd.com. Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's what it is.
Yeah, and find out more details about where Mark is and where you can have more with him. Mark talks about a story in his book. The book we're talking about is The Trauma of Everyday Life. And he talks about the story of a woman by the name of Kissa Gotami. And she had a lament of, why did this happen to me? And often I hear that lament. Sometimes I've even issued that lament myself. And I would love for Mark to share that story as one that helps us understand loss.
Sure. Well, it's a very powerful story, one of the central stories in the Buddhist canon about a young woman, as you said, named Kissa Gotami, whose baby died, actually. And her baby died young. The mother, Kissa Gotami, was basically going mad. She was wandering around the village, clutching the dead baby to her, scaring all of the villagers, demanding that somebody help her bring the baby back to life. And people were scared of her. They ran away from her. Finally, one person approached her and said, I do know of one person who can help you. And he pointed up, over the hill to where the Buddha was camping with his followers. He said, there's a guy over there, they call him the Buddha, he can help you. And she went to him. She went to the Buddha, holding still her dead baby. And he took her in, ushered her in, and said, yes, I believe I can help you, but first I need you to do one thing for me. Would you bring me a mustard seed from the village, from the house of someone where no one has died? And she's like, okay, finally. And she set out for the village, and knocking on doors, asking for if there was anyone in any of these houses where no one had died. And she couldn't find such a house. She came back to the Buddha, stopping to put her baby down. That's a nice part, or a sad part, a moving part of the story. She puts her baby down in the forest, comes back to the Buddha, and says, the people say the living are few, but the dead are many. He says, yes, true. Let me give you some basic teachings. And she settles down and begins to learn what he can teach her about the ubiquity of trauma and of things that are hard to face, and of life and death being an inevitable part, not something wrong, not something that only happens to some people, and not something that happens because of your bad karma, but just an inevitable part of the laws of the universe, And the story goes on. She gets enlightened several days later by she's out at night looking at the lights flickering across the way, and she has the realization, my state is like those lamps, one moment lit and the next extinguished. And there's an acceptance there, a generosity and a compassion that was developed in her from talking to the other people in the village, all of whom had lost people. She had thought it was only her. And then this greater understanding of transience as not being a mistake and not being wrong, but as being something that we are all made of, rather than something we have to keep at bay.
Yeah, like Kissa Gotami, when we feel isolated and alone, it's really hard to bear the loss. And yet when we have help and support, we can find a way to go on.
Yeah. Well, when it happens to us, we feel like we're the only ones that it's happening to. I think that's a key element, both of the story and of a current understanding of trauma. It's incredibly isolating because it's as if no one can really understand what we're going through. and then there's so much of a push in the culture to get over it, you know, a kind of rush to normal, where we feel like we have to speed through Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief and mourning so that we can, you know, get to acceptance and move on in our lives. And I don't think it necessarily happens in any kind of prescribed way. It can take a long time to grieve somebody.
It sure can. And those who are regular listeners will know on last week's show, I interviewed Melissa Dalton Bradford, and she wrote a book called On Loss and Living Onward, and her son died at the age of 18. And she really spent that first year in a kind of withdrawal and isolation period that she absolutely needed to be in to understand what had happened. She found the Jewish term avelut, which she decided to take on and live through, even though her own background was, I believe she said she had a Christian background, but she loved that concept that she was allowed to set aside a period of time for mourning and not have to move on quickly. And I hear you echoing that sentiment as we're having this conversation today as well.
Sure.
Yeah. What, in addition to the company of others, what are some other things that we can do? Maybe Buddhist practices that are helpful, or other things that we can know or hold on to when we are going through either really tragic losses, or when we're at a place where those losses that have been down in the basement for a while are really banging on the door and want to come up. What are some of the either being or doing things that can support us?
Well, I think not to neglect the value of psychotherapy. You know, I think psychotherapy it's really a miracle that we have it in our culture. We have such a culture of rushing and doing, and hardly anything that supports being with another person with no agenda other than to try to understand what's happening, you know, right now in the room between them. So I think even though some people have been proclaiming the death of psychotherapy, I think it's still very much alive and so useful for people.
And it sounds like when you're talking about psychotherapy, you're also talking about a kind of psychotherapy that's highly relational, where the connection between the therapist and the client or patient is really attended to.
Yeah, well, I think it would be hard to imagine a psychotherapy that's not relational, since it really is just two people in a room talking or listening to each other. But there is a movement, which is what you're referring to, I think, within the field towards a more quote-unquote relational approach, where finally the therapist realized that they didn't have to just be a blank screen or a kind of omniscient, powerful authority looking down, but that the value of the treatment lies as much in the relationship as it does in any kind of knowledge that the therapist has to impart. And I think that's been a very healthy development in the field. People in our culture in particular are looking for authenticity from their therapist. They're looking for friendship and someone who they can talk to. And often that's hard to find in our regular lives, where we have to put on one kind of a face or another, or worry about saying embarrassing things, or hurting the image that other people have of us.
Yeah, it really is a healing relationship. You were getting ready to go on to something else that can support us.
I've been very helped in my own life. Even before I went into therapy or became a therapist, I was somehow drawn to the Buddhist world when I was still in college and started practicing, going on, 10-day, 2-week silent retreats and learning about mindfulness, learning about meditation in my 20s. And that really gave me the courage and the strength to go back and go to medical school and train as a doctor, train as a psychiatrist, because I felt like I had found what I needed for myself. And I think that there's much within those meditative practices that, especially if you engage with them before your life hits you too hard with the various traumas and losses and so on, that you can kind of build up an understanding and maybe a resiliency that helps you when the glass falls and breaks. You know, you've been training yourself for a period of time to know that the glass is already broken, so that when it actually shatters, it's not a total surprise. And it not being a total surprise gives you a little bit of inoculation against the slings and arrows that life throws at us.
Yes, I hear you saying something in there about just as we live, knowing that there are going to be things that come our way that are hard to deal with. It was whatever that was you talked about in the beginning, dukkha, hard to face, that throughout life we'll go in and out of events happening or times when life, for one reason or another, is hard to face. And knowing that, it reminds me of when I was having a hard time about 11 years ago, and I went to talk to somebody about it, and he said, well, I said, I just keep waiting for the next shoe to drop. And he said, well, it will. How are you going to live well in between?
Yeah, that's nice.
And that was great.
I like to say that if we're not suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, that we're suffering from pre-traumatic stress disorder, because it's lurking.
Yeah. And it was somehow relieving to know that, we're going to go in and out of hard times. And if I think I'm not, then I'm really going to have a hard time when something does show up on my doorstep.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say about that is not to set yourself up to have to face the difficult thing with a kind of preordained acceptance or calmness or Buddhist whatever, like the thing about Buddhist practice is it really teaches you that you know very little about anything. So you're not going to know how you're going to face death. I've known very accomplished Zen teachers who, when they themselves were dying, were totally terrified, and they weren't pretending to be otherwise. They were purely, totally terrified. And did all their Buddhist practice help or not? We don't know.
What a terrific reminder to know that we don't have to know.
Yeah, but that just makes it worse when you're laying some kind of expectation on yourself.
Yeah. Well, we're coming up closely on the end of our show here, Mark. What's one thought that you might leave our listeners with? How might you summarize everything in one or two sentences?
Well, I was reading the other day a wonderful book by a woman named Leslie Jameson, which is called The Empathy Exams, and she said something that I memorized, which was the following. She said, empathy means realizing that no trauma has discrete edges. Trauma bleeds out of wounds and across boundaries. Empathy demands another kind of porousness in response.
A beautiful way to end our show. I would like for you to stay on the line for just a moment if you could, Mark. I want to thank you for joining me today. And I thank you, listeners, for tuning in to The Trauma of Everyday Life with Mark Epstein. Join us next week when shamanic practitioner Larry LoBianco joins me to talk about ritual for healing and transformation. Until then, this is Cathy Roberts. Embrace vitality. Transform your life.
Thank you for listening to Voices for Healing. Please join Cathy Roberts again next Monday morning at 8 a.m. Pacific Time, 11 a.m. Eastern Time on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. We wish you the best recovery from your loss, and we'll talk again next week.
Thanks again for listening to the preceding program, brought to you on the Voice America Health and Wellness Channel. For more information about our network and to check out additional show hosts and topics of interest, please visit voiceamericahealth.com. The Voice America Talk Radio Network is the worldwide leader in live Internet talk radio. Visit voiceamerica.com. The views and ideas expressed on the preceding program are strictly those of the host or guests and do not necessarily reflect the views and ideas held by the Voice America Talk Radio Network, its staff, and management.